Good evening once again. I'm Chris Jansing in for Brian Williams. Day 196 of the Biden administration. Tonight, the president has joined the chorus of voices from both parties calling on longtime political ally and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to step down after today's explosive report from that state's attorney general. That AG report alleges Cuomo sexually harassed 11 women, including a state trooper.
Are you now calling on him to resign?
Yes.
Do you think he should be prosecuted?
What I said was, if the investigation of the Attorney General concluded that the allegations are correct, that back in March, that I would recommend he resign. That's what I'm doing today.
Biden is just one of many Democratic politicians in federal, state, and local positions who now say Cuomo can no longer remain in office. State Attorney General Letitia James issued her report following a 5-month-long civil investigation. The 165-page document paints a damning portrait of unwelcome and inappropriate behavior.
Governor Cuomo sexually harassed current and former state employees in violation of both federal and state laws. The independent investigation found that Governor Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women, many of whom were young women, by engaging in unwanted groping, kisses, hugging, and by making inappropriate comments. The governor and his senior team took actions to retaliate against at least one former employee for coming forward with her story, her truth. And Governor Cuomo's administration fostered a toxic workplace that enabled harassment and created a hostile work environment where staffers did not feel comfortable coming forward with complaints about sexual harassment due to a climate of fear and given the power dynamics.
The investigation was launched after multiple women accused Cuomo earlier this year of unwelcome personal comments or physical contact. One of the many encounters laid out in the report describes Cuomo allegedly embracing an executive assistant and reaching under her blouse to grab her breast. Another involved a New York State trooper assigned to Cuomo's security detail, whose allegations had not been previously reported.
The governor also several times inappropriately touched a state trooper assigned to the unit to protect the governor. In an elevator, while standing behind the trooper, he ran his finger from her neck down her spine and said, "Hey, you." Another time, she was standing holding the door open for the governor. As he passed, he took his open hand and ran it across her stomach from her belly button to the hip where she keeps her gun. The state trooper, the touching incidents, the one where he touched her stomach was witnessed by another state trooper who confirmed it to us. The kiss, the governor kissed her once. That was confirmed to us by another state trooper.
The Attorney General's investigative team says it reviewed more than 74,000 pieces of evidence and interviewed 179 people. The governor denies the allegations. And this afternoon, he issued this pre-recorded rebuttal, complete with photos he'd included of people hugging and kissing.
I never touched anyone inappropriately or made inappropriate sexual advances. I am 63 years old. I've lived my entire adult life in public view. That is just not who I am. And that's not who I have ever been. I do kiss people on the forehead. I do kiss people on the cheek. We are living in a superheated, if not toxic, political environment. Politics and bias are interwoven throughout every aspect of this situation. For those who are using this moment to score political points or seek publicity or personal gain, I say they actually discredit the legitimate sexual harassment victims that the law was designed to protect.
Andrew Cuomo is now under criminal investigation. The New York prosecutor leading that inquiry has requested material from the state attorney general's office, and he's encouraging other victims to come forward.
The allegations early on certainly led myself and other prosecutors with concurrent jurisdiction to believe that criminal activity, in fact, had taken place. But we will conduct our own independent investigation. It will be done expeditiously. and we will arrive at those conclusions.
So, Phil, the governor appears to be hanging tough tonight, even as the kind of mechanics to remove him through impeachment appear to be underway in Albany. Here's what the AP reports. I'm quoting here. In a television conversation with the New York State Assembly Speaker, Carl Heastie, Cuomo insisted he wouldn't leave office and told the speaker he needed to work fellow Democrats and garner enough votes to stop an impeachment, according to a person familiar with the conversation. For those who don't live in New York, who aren't familiar with Andrew Cuomo's ways, what does that tell us about who he is as a political figure and how he has operated, particularly within the Democratic Party?
You know, Chris, Governor Cuomo is spoiling for a fight, clearly. He's a political island tonight. He has virtually no support from within his own party, the Democratic Party. President Biden obviously is calling for him to resign, but so too is every member of the New York congressional delegation, many of the leaders of the New York state legislature. And as you just noted, impeachment proceedings are due to begin in due course and quickly in Albany. And so he may be forced out of office, but he's clearly not taking the hint and resigning gracefully as most Democratic leaders would like to see him do. And in a way, he's acting very Trumpian. This is the same way that Donald Trump handled so many controversies in his presidency. He, denied any wrongdoing again and again and again, and then would hope people forget and he can stay in office and continue to plug away and charge ahead. That's what Cuomo's trying to do in New York. It may not work, however, because, again, we should just underscore that he is an isolated political figure tonight, has no support in his party.
Yamiche, in fact, you asked the president today about possible prosecution for Cuomo. Talk about their relationship over the years. Wasn't there even talk at one time that he might join the administration?
Well, that's right. And these were two men who have known each other for a long, long time. But President Biden made clear in an interview way back in March that if there were allegations that were corroborated and that the governor was found to actually have sexually assaulted, sexually harassed women, then he would call for his resignation. And President Biden added that he'll probably also be prosecuted. That's what he said in March, which is why I was pressing President Biden to say, well, do you think that these women should get justice in the form of a prosecution against the governor? But the president said, in fact, that he had not read the entire report and would reserve comment on that. The big picture here is, though, that is exactly what Phil was just talking about. It is this idea that because after former President Trump, there's so many people who think maybe I can hold on. Let's remember that the former president had dozens and dozens of women come out with their names saying that they had been sexually assaulted, even raped by the former president. And the former president continued to have political power. He continues to have political power right here in the Republican Party. The issue with Andrew Cuomo, of course, is that Democrats have made fighting back against sexual assault, fighting back against sexual harassment, a core part of their ideal. And as a result, you're seeing people like Senator Gillibrand, but of course now House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the president, Chuck Schumer, all of these high and prominent Democrats saying this governor has to go. So I think Andrew Cuomo is absolutely isolated. He is in a party that has said that they're not going to stand for this sort of behavior. And as a result, it's going to be very, very hard for the governor to stay. Of course, there are people that I talk to say they don't imagine him resigning because of the fact that he's had this sort of bullish personality where he doesn't really want to give up a fight. But we could see the governor impeached possibly.
I think that when you look again at that rebuttal, it was part politics, part legal. You could make that argument. So I'm interested in what you thought about it as a legal strategy as part of that lengthy rebuttal that was released by, first of all, there's a written document released by Cuomo's lawyers in response to the New York Attorney General's report. And they included images showing other political leaders embracing people, politicians embracing him. And he said he's someone who naturally embraces people. We also saw those kinds of images in his pre-recorded statement. What do you make of this as both a legal strategy and I guess trying to win people over? I'm just a friendly guy.
Yeah, right. I view it as weak. I think what he's trying to do is be Joe Biden, and he's not Joe Biden. He is somebody who has 11. I mean, we're not talking about one or two. We're talking about 11 women who have accused him of sexual harassment. And several of them have been corroborated by other people watching him do it. And worse, the staff was told about it in his office, and they had a policy not to allow women to be alone with him. That tells you what you need to know. And the fact that he's kissed his mother in public, or that Biden has kissed people, or that George Bush kissed people has absolutely nothing to do, and it's not admissible in any court in this country, as to what he was doing. So I thought it was weak and a disgrace to his family name.